Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of SaaS Showdown. I'm Colin McCarthy, and this is my friend, colleague, partner in crime,
Rose Layton.
And today we are talking about sources of truth. And what is a source of truth? Well, it's the accurate record of who is who. What's their name? Who is their line manager? What department do they work in? Are they a full-time employee, FTE? Are they a contractor or any other special profile information? But why do we need all of this information? Rose?
Well, Colin, I think we've talked about this before, but connecting your SaaS services together is one of the most powerful things you can do for yourself, for your organization. And one of the things that you need when you connect all of those things together is something that syncs your users between them, right? And so your source of truth is whatever is sitting at the top of that flow. So usually, I guess in an ideal world, this is your HRIS, right? That's where your people first enter your company. Usually they're recruited or, they're hired, and then HR enters them into the system along with their start date.
So you said the acronym HRIS, which is, I guess, Human Resources Information System.
I think that's what it stands for. I honestly not 100% clear on that.
I'm sure it is.
As opposed to like your payroll systems, right? Which sometimes are different, sometimes they're the same. But so usually that's where your people start. So that's why HRIS is an ideal place to have your source of truth. One thing about using your HRIS is I know that you have worked at places and I have worked at places where the HRIS system in place doesn't like to play well with your other systems.
Yeah, there's a lot of legacy systems around from the old on-premise Active Directory days where you might have your HRIS system might not be SaaS. Isn't software as a service. It's physically installed on a server. It sits there on a gray box in the corner and people put employees' data into it. But yeah, those often typically don't play well.
But then there are also enterprise HRIS systems that don't like to play well with others. ADP is one shining example of a really excellent payroll software, but their HRIS system tagged on to the payroll software doesn't really like to integrate.
Right. So, and I guess that's a problem of some of those legacy ones. And I have been quite surprised in the last few years, the number of sort of startup HRIS systems that have embraced this new SaaS and SaaS Ops world. Bamboo
Absolutely.
HR, namely, and Workday seem to, even though they're not essentially a new product, but certainly have taken HRS by storm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, HRIS in the cloud by storm. Well, and so connecting these products to sort of whatever is giving your authentication provides just such a deeper understanding of your users. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you basically have to get HR to put in a ticket every time someone's hired, which sometimes is a fraught thing, right? Like some HR teams and IT teams do not work well together. We've seen that on the SaaS Apps community, people saying, how do I get HR to tell me when somebody's going to start so I'm not surprised on that person's start date?
Yeah. And I guess every time you're entering in a piece of manual information that has already been entered once, every time you're copying it into another platform, you open it up for the possibility of error, things being incorrect, overlooked. So there's an ability to improve accuracy and streamline things by automating off of your source of truth, whatever that might be.
That's definitely true because it copies the email address to all the right places. It copies their name to all the right places. It copies whatever profile data you have configured. And some places have really deep profile configurations. We've watched webinars and, episodes of various other podcasts and video casts about automating various profile data fields, including like personal pronouns or
preferred name and legal name. Obviously, payroll and HR.
That's one that's near and dear to my heart.
need to know your legal name, because that's often
But you don't always want to go by your legal name. There's a long-standing tradition in the Midwest in the United States of going by your middle name, and I am one of those people, even though I'm not from the Midwest, who goes by my middle name. And it's always been frustrating to have my email address and my name just across the company be my first name, even though everybody calls me by this other thing. So like, I think when people think about some of these things, they're like, oh, like what a new mystical world we live in, right? Where people need to go by their preferred names and like they need to be able to change their name. These things have always been happening, right? People get married. People go by different names. People, their lives just happen. And so now, companies who had adapted to being able to do those things, right? Companies who could change someone's name when they got married, companies who had the ability to be flexible about what name people were called, are better equipped, would you say, to deal with Gen Z and the millennials kind of moving into the workforce? I say that as a millennial, but
Yeah, yes. It's if you're changing the names of users through marriage and legal name changes or preferred names is very simple to do on an individual application basis. If you just have Office 365 and Robert Smith joins the company, and Robert Smith has been hired by recruitment, HR processed him, talent, IT get a ticket that Robert Smith has started. Robert Smith starts and says, the only person who calls me Robert is my mother. Everybody else calls me Bob. Can you change my username to be Bob Smith? That's easy to do when it's just one account, but it becomes more complicated and more of a task, in my experience, in the large scale sprawling application landscape with everything being single sign-on in and all of the other intricacies that come from that. So the idea, I guess, and the philosophy is to have your source of truth being accurate in one place from the start.
Right. Well, so my follow-up question was going to be, if you decide, let's say today you're working with kind of disparate systems, or HR is putting in tickets, right? And you want to kind of like hedge that off at the beginning. What do you feel like your first steps are to integrating an HRIS with the rest of your identity?
Hopefully when we came to choosing that HRS system, it would have a robust API platform, right. which many don't. And also when choosing that HRS system, which isn't something that people generally switch from one to another.
No, I don't know. I've done that a few times.
In my recent career history, we only switched from one very rigid platform to a new, sort of SaaS-based platform. And I don't expect we'll ever move off of that. But making sure whatever platform you do choose has customizable fields for, preferred name.
Or even if you just want to track, like, let's say you have a fancy employee leveling system, right? And you want to put your employees' levels in it. Or you want to be able to honor employee of the month, right? And you need a field for that. So there's lots of reasons to need custom fields.
Yeah. And having that good HRS system with a robust API that can then work with your other platforms does allow you to utilize that as your profile information source of truth. Because I have found that having a more filled out end user profile, or wherever that may be, whether it's in, I guess, Okta or Google Workspace or Office Azure AD, you can automate a lot of stuff out of that those attributes. But
Right.
if you don't have a way of automating or centrally updating those attributes, then they become unmanageable, they become incorrect, your automations won't work. So
right. If your users have to put in a ticket to update their own user profiles, that's going to go down very quickly. I wanted to touch on something you said before where, so step one, get a good HRIS,
Yep.
right? Understand the limitations of it, understand what it can do. And I would verify any claims that your HRIS says in terms of integration.
Yes.
I have been told by HRIS systems previously that like they could do X, Y, and Z, right? And then when push came to shove, they absolutely could not. And it took like weeks of back and forth to do it.
There can be a whole show on how to correctly evaluate SaaS applications or any applications, because
did we already do that show? We already did that show.
I know we've discussed it in other places. I can't remember. Yeah, we did. Episode 3, I think, choosing a SaaS application. But yeah,
Ta-da.
doing
all of those things apply to this.
doing a proper live test, because salesmen, salespeople, sales ladies, we love them. However, there is often a bit of exaggeration. Sometimes goes into the pitch saying, "Oh yeah, I'll speak to engineering. I'm sure we can do that," and you can't. So do kick the tires, spin up a test. It's so easy.
Step 2, I would think, is look at the data. So the format of the data inside your HRIS sometimes is not what you expect. And getting an HR export of your users and looking at the raw data, I think, is very important, because one thing that is not going to work if you try to start automating from the HRIS is if you think a field is formatted a particular way and it's not. Like, even if it's just as simple as something like you thought this was a string and it's actually an array.
Right.
Right. And I've had to deal with that before in other systems where something was unexpectedly passing an array. And to get it into Okta, I had to account for that in my profile mapping, right? And my like data transformation.
Right.
Which is fine. I could do it. I just had to know first. And then also you might, especially if your IT team doesn't have access to the HR systems, which is also, that's sort of a 50-50 thing I've found. Sometimes IT has access and sometimes they don't. If you are one of those teams that don't, you may not know what the data looks like in there because you are not one of the people who helps maintain the system. So for instance, in a previous employer, I found that they were labeling people's department for like the core, I guess, external facing group of people, right? The people who provide the service that company was providing. Mm-hmm. They would label their department as their primary client.
Right.
Instead of actually labeling their department how I would label their department as like, blah, blah, blah operations, whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever we called it internally, right? And you don't necessarily, you might, but you don't necessarily want that data to pass in the same way. And there usually are rules that you can make to sort of match on it and change it. Right, especially in Okta, OneLogin, places like that, where you can really modify this data based on certain regex expressions or whatever.
Yeah.
Like you can take data that looks a certain way and turn it into something else as part of the profile mapping.
Right.
But you need to know what that data looks like to do any of that. And if your data is not clean, if it's inconsistent, if it's, to know any of that, you have to look at the data first.
Right. Yeah. It goes down, but to the old adage, garbage in, garbage out. So I was,
yes.
You always have to clean your data regardless of what you're doing. If you're doing a simple VLOOKUP in a Google Sheet, you
have to keep it clean moving forward.
Right.
It's not a one point in time. Like I think you probably had this experience too, where like somebody comes to you and is like, hey, I just tried to onboard so-and-so. But their, XYZ, whatever account isn't creating or isn't licensed or whatever. And you go back and you look through the system and they've entered their profile information wrong.
Right. So you've got to validate it by putting controls in place to make sure what you're requesting is in the correct format. So this is,
if you can, otherwise you just kind of have to, if you have a small team, you can try to train them, but accidents will happen.
Right. But for large scale operations, or even, it doesn't matter what your scale of your operation is. If you want to have, a very streamlined, smooth, automated process, but certainly for large organizations, then this source of truth and automation of account provision or even account deprovision is, really needs to be done. And
when you're onboarding and offboarding hundreds of people every couple of weeks, like, you don't want to have to spot check anything.
No.
Right? Like, that's going to be a huge waste of your time. Because it's so much work. It's so much to do. And unless you're going to hire somebody specifically to do that, it's just not worth it. So putting the systems in, like you said, to validate the data, make sure it's in the right format. And then also, sometimes you do just have to train your users, right? Like, they need to label department as this thing, or instead of using this field, they need to use this custom profile field, or, this is where preferred name goes and this is where your first name goes. Right.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
At some point, unfortunately, well, I guess that's not true. There are ways now, and I'm just learning this because now I'm part of a larger organization with a big recruiting org. And there are ways to take your recruiting data and go straight to your HR.
I was just about to ask, we've been for the last...
In my previous org, that would have been unheard of. Like, we just weren't onboarding enough people for that. But in my current org now, like, it's something that I think is really interesting. Like, the data that I entered as an applicant can transition and become part of my life cycle as an employee.
Yeah. So for the last 15 minutes, we've been talking about HRIS systems being a source of truth, but as being essentially the first time an employee comes into the company through HR. But obviously, as you've said, that's not their first point of contact. A potential employees or a future employee's first point of contact will be through the recruitment team, probably using Greenhouse.
Application process,
Probably using Greenhouse. Greenhouse, I think, seems to be everywhere nowadays. I know there are other recruitment platforms out there. But I know Greenhouse
does seem to be like the it girl of recruitment platforms.
Yes, yeah, and it does have an API, and there's things that can be automated. So if either you're taking that information from the applicant, or you're taking that information off of the applicant's application, their resume, CV, and then putting it in, is it as simple as a case of, Robert Smith gets the job. They've put down that their preferred name is Bob in Greenhouse. They get employed. Somebody ticks that little box in Greenhouse that says hired, and magically all of those APIs go all the way through, adding them to Bamboo, let's say, and then Bamboo talks to Okta, and then Okta provisions, a Google Workspace and a Zoom account and a Slack account.
Well, and so that's what I guess, that's one of the ways that you can have a source of truth that's not the HRIS system, right? That's the recruiting system. Now, obviously that relies on, number one, you having a recruiting system that will do that. And it relies on the applicant having to fill out those forms, right? There are people who kind of use Greenhouse for posting jobs, but they don't actually use Greenhouse for applying for jobs. And I've seen other systems where, for example, like in order to make it work, people were using recruiting platforms to post and manage the roles, but then we're actually using the HRIS sort of adjacent platform to take applications for the roles. And ADP has a notoriously bad one, and it's terrible. But this is not like a ringing unendorsement of ADP, I guess, but they do payroll really well.
All right. So there's a number of different ways. So,
but the other way that we didn't talk about is you can use Okta OneLogin Jump Cloud, Google as your source of truth.
And then have them write the other way down into Bamboo or Workday or Namely.
It is possible.
Right.
With Better Cloud.
Yep. Good.
You could create somebody. Yeah. Well, and I think it just depends on what your environment looks like, right? Different flows will work for different teams. I've seen a lot of really interesting and innovative ways to make that happen. I think, if I had to pick a flow that was like the Nirvana flow, it would be recruiting, HR, identity access management system, whether that's Azure, Okta, Google, whatever you have. And then your SaaS applications below that.
That does sound like the most click, less, the most automated, less click solution, because the information would only have to be entered in once, would be correct.
Right. I will say the one sort of gap that I've noticed there is updating the profile information, because often when you're using recruiting platforms or HRIS systems as the initial sort of input of data, the update of data also has to go up to that level. And I think that, like the Okta profile information always felt more user-friendly to me.
Right.
And some people may feel differently, right? If you have a really stellar HRIS system, like maybe your profile updating is really awesome, but like I use Workday now and like leaves a lot to be desired in terms of UX.
I would be concerned with updates being automated, because you wouldn't want somebody to accidentally make a change in your HRS system, or either incorrectly or correctly update somebody, and then automatically passes through to all of these other systems. Because often if somebody has got married and they're changing their name, you need to time the change of that
very
name
carefully.
You have to let the end user know, and they have to often be involved. And then it's the other systems. While you might have single sign-on into a number of other applications, but the account that's on those systems needs to be updated as well. So because you've changed your name and your identity, it means that maybe 10,000 feet hasn't updated and it's still looking, or Asana or any other application, and you've got to, or Zoom, you've got to change that username that's expecting that single sign-on.
Or it's going to create another user, which is not a good experience for anybody.
Or say, failure, user not found.
Or it's going to fail. And I think, sometimes there's controls that you can do, where you're like, take this field when it's updated, but not this one, right? And I used to configure that kind of stuff in Okta. I was like, I don't want anybody to update their username this way, so they can't do that.
Yep.
But, if someone's last name changes, allow that to change. Or like, don't allow their email address to change, but allow their last name to change, allow their department to change, right? Their manager. Because part of the benefit of using the HRIS system is that they do have access to sort of a key set of data, which is like the user relationship data, which can be very tedious to update manually later if you lose track of it. And so when you can get the manager data from the HRIS system and update it continuously, it's just, I think it can be a much better experience, especially for a growing organization where that data may be changing all the time as part of restructures and reorgs.
Yes, certainly if you're
or during mergers and acquisitions where the same thing is happening.
Yeah. And certainly if you've got automated offboarding workflows or automated, Slack channel provision workflows or some other application, drive sharing automation. If somebody moves from a different department or a different team or has a different line manager, the line manager field
we're going to spend a whole episode
that
talking
we
about
have
that, Colin.
in Google Workspace is very important, certainly when you come to automating the offboarding of a user and correctly transferring their documents and access to the line manager is very important
exactly.
to have that being.
if you're offboarding somebody and you're, as part of that flow, you're granting access or trading information to their frontline manager, it's pretty important that the frontline manager listed on their profile is correct.
Yeah. And that often gets updated in the HRS system before,
nowhere else.
Nowhere else. So having that flow, even for that, even if you didn't do everything, if you just picked a few attributes to sync, I think you become in a lot better SaaS situation and really utilize some of those SaaS Ops mentalities and technologies. We're coming close to discussing this for 30 minutes. And I know we both have probably meetings to head off to. Any closing thoughts, tidbits for source of truth systems?
Yeah, I mean, I did want to just sort of call out that, like, obviously, we talked about sort of ideal scenarios here. Mm-hmm. But, as I mentioned, I changed organizations and now I work at a much larger organization, and we have 2 parallel identity systems because of the services that each one is granting access to and the controls that each one is giving us over how we grant access. And so, like, I don't want people like out there to think that like there's any one particular model that will work. I will say, it can be extraordinarily simplified, and you can take out a lot of work by doing it in that sort of single flow fashion. And it really is, it's very zen. The whole thing is. But that doesn't work for every organization.
No.
Right. And it does take a long time to get there. Like identity and, source of truth projects tend to be very, very long projects because they can impact your users in a number of different ways. I've shut off access to a very important app for an entire company before, trying to make one change to update how the identity system worked. So I know some of the things that you can do wrong.
Yes.
And so I just want to say that, like, for people who are listening to this who don't have one of those like nirvanas and environments, that's fine, right? Yep. Take your time, think about what shape works for your organization, where you're at now and where you might want to be in the future, right? And that's, I think, sometimes those are 2 very different shapes, right? Especially if you're going through a lot of change.
Yeah. And so, be careful, plan out your changes, do tests. I personally build
a sandbox. Yeah.
But a sandbox. I personally did accidentally rename 300 users by trying to automate our HR assist. Or the Stacys became Anastasia, or the Matts became Matthews, or the Daves became David. Yeah. Thankfully, it was all in the logs. So a bit of auditing, a bit of VLOOKUP, and a bit of bulk uploads of renaming everybody.
We should have an episode just about that. About like weird, sometimes terrible mistakes we've made. One time I accidentally renamed a user to someone else. I
don't know. We should do a mistakes. The other worst mistake I did, I put an out of office on the wrong person, and that person was a key. He was the only database admin at the time, and it freaked half of the company out when they got an out of office saying that he'd left the company. So
that's funny.
That's why things need to be automated and not manual, because you're less likely to have a mistake.
Right. Yeah. So, the less number of manual steps you have in there, the less likely you are to make a mistake. But you do have to be very careful when you're making changes to systems like this that can affect lots of things downstream.
Yeah. Well, it's been great, Rose, as always, talking about SaaS and SaaS Ops with you in another episode of SaaS Showdown.
Woohoo.
Produced by the Tab Geeks Network. Enjoy all of our shows on YouTube at youtube.com/tabgeeks. Join our exclusive, free, no sponsors allowed Slack community and sign up for our newsletter at tabgeeks.com.